Now, I guess I upset some people on Reddit, which is okay, but I suggested that you can use non-macro lenses for macro that sometimes work better than macro lenses. Let me explain. Now, some people suggested that macro lenses, since they're specifically designed for macro, that they are better than non-macro lenses. Now, let me explain something about macro lenses. The only thing that makes a lens macro is its distance from the sensor to the film. So if you increase the distance between the sensor and the lens, that'll give you macro. In other words, you have to get closer to an object, but also fills the frame better, right? That's all macro is. Now, there are some lenses it won't work with, right? And there's obviously lenses that are better quality with that will work in that manner, and they will work better than they work better if you just bought a macro lens, of course. But there's limitations to macro lenses. The limitations are that there's only so much macro you can get out of a macro lens. There is a limit. In other words, you can't you can't macro any closer to an object than the macro lens is made for. And that's why there are things like macro lens filters. There's things like macro tubes, and there's also things like bellows. Now, bellows also does increase that distance between the lens and the sensor or the film, whatever medium you're working with. Regardless, you're increasing that distance, and that's what creates the macro. Let me offer a suggestion. If you think that macro lenses were specifically made for macro and are better for macro, then what are large format lenses made for processing if they can do better than a one-to-one reproduction with a very, very high fidelity of line reproduction? Well, I'm not suggesting that you take, like, let's say, an Apo-Ronar 600mm f9 and adapt it to your camera, because that's also a very long focal length for a 35mm camera or sensor. What I'm suggesting is that there are lenses out there that will outperform a $400, $600, $800 macro lens that was made specifically for macro for a particular digital camera from a manufacturer. That's what I am suggesting. To suggest that there's no alternatives and then you can't get as good of a macro image because it's not a specific macro lens and made specifically for that task, then it can't possibly make a better image is absolutely incorrect. And I will check people on that any day, no matter how many thumbs down I get on some forum in, Reddit or whatever.